So let's talk about this phenomenon, which is a little confusing, of hyper and hyposensitivity, because you'll definitely see both in the autistic population. Many autistic people have a lot of struggle with just moving about in the world. Smells can be literally disabling. Fragrances, like synthetic fragrances, really, I have been through this. I have sometimes been laid up with a migraine for a whole day because somebody sprayed perfume near me, or I went into the store and didn't get out fast enough. So this isn't just in my head. I know that because it's my own experience. This is a neurological reaction that some of us have to environmental facets, and it can really make it hard to just live ordinary life. So fragrance is one factor. Um, Pollution, smells, of course. You know, people who are hypersensitive are going to be more affected by that kind of thing. Um, but there's also music can be annoying or bothersome or feel too loud. People's voices sometimes are off-putting. So again, in a sexual interaction, that can be something that people can be very sensitive to in a way that it takes them out of the moment, or they can't enjoy what's happening because their partner's saying something too loud, or there's an edge to their voice that seems uncomfortable and off-putting, and it's distracting. Um, Anything to do with uh, this sense of distractibility, though, can really present problems for autistic people because it means that it subtracts from our ability to concentrate on what we're trying to do or what we want to do, and other things are intruding on our physical space, even if it's just sound. Um, so, in terms of a sexual context, people need to sort out, like, do you want music on or off, and does it help you get in the mood, or is it something that it's an unwelcome distraction? And you know, like you were saying earlier, people have to have a conversation about these things so they can lay the groundwork and have the possibility of something effective happening without all these unwanted factors getting in the way. Um, Another thing is lights. Having just a sensitivity to light, particular kinds of light, like these new headlights on cars. I'm just like, we're not in Alaska, you know, in the middle of winter. Do we really need this much brightness? But there's just bright lights that can be bothersome, and sometimes you can tolerate them, other times they're wretched. Um, Having lights on and off during sex, and people sorting out, you know, at what times is it welcome and pleasant to have your partner face to face with you and in close proximity, and for some people that's overwhelming. It's kind of like, you know, those studies they did of babies who get overstimulated. The baby can't do very much, they can't walk yet, they can't move away from the scenario, but they show they're overstimulated by doing this to the parent or the person who's doing the research, right? So it's the same kind of phenomenon that autistic people might experience, that they might feel sexual and they want to be close with their partner, but maybe face to face or eye contact is more than they can handle at that moment. And I wonder how much this, you know, sense of overstimulation also means that it's just difficult to be in conversation because visually you're taking in so much information that your brain can't process all the visual input and produce words at the same time, or you know, can't comprehend everything that's coming at you. And then we've talked about, you know, this idea that skin on skin might not be welcome at all times for autistic people. Maybe they want to be sexual, but they want to keep some clothes on so that they don't have too much input. Um, and then, you know, everything about the surroundings, like the bedding has to feel comfortable and not have crumbs on it, or, you know, not be scratchy or have feathers sticking in your butt or something. And you can't have too many noises and smells going on. That might mean maybe the neighbor's dog is barking and it takes you out of the mood, and you have to be able to tell your partner, hey, wait a minute, I just need a minute to come back here. That was really irritating and distracted me. So there's just all these kinds of aspects of physical experience that might need to get verbalized and communicated with the partner so that the rapport isn't broken, so that each person has a window into what's going on in the other person's experience and why they're behaving the way that they do. And for people, I mean, in terms of a sexual experience specifically, for people to have an orgasm requires surrender, right? It requires a temporary suspension of control. And so for autistic people, that's especially difficult because we spend a lot of time trying to control ourselves and control our surroundings so we can be comfortable and tolerate what's happening, and then to be able to switch gears and have an orgasm, like you were saying about your client, Sharon. It's, for a lot of people that's challenging, or it takes summoning up some degree of concentration that neurotypicals might not need to exercise. So let's talk about, we're going to switch now to gender orientation and sexual orientation, because this is very prevalent in the autistic population. Let me see if I can find the things about, there was specifically a study done in Sweden, I think. Let me see how I can describe this to you succinctly. The researchers did a study asking people to identify whether they were, they just were given 3 categories. Are you heterosexual, homosexual, or bisexual? And the general population was able to respond to these questions, but when it came to autistic people responding, about 20% of the autistics wrote in none of the above. So there's a higher proportion than ordinary people of autistic people who are unwilling or unable to define their sexual orientation. So there's a lot of ambiguity and curiosity about ambiguity among autistics about all matters sexual. And autistic people tend to be ones who are very willing to raise questions and challenge the way things are done. So I think this is useful to know that if you have somebody in your office who identifies as autistic, or you suspect they may be autistic, there's some high probability that they're also sexually aberrant, we could say. And I don't mean that with any pejorative meaning. It just means they're going to be different in a lot of other ways, as well as the cognitive or the emotional differences that might be more obvious. So, we just want to encourage clinicians who are working with people on the spectrum to be open to different ways of describing sexual orientation and discussing sexuality, because it's a really important aspect of who we all are, but it's especially creative when it comes to autistic people. So I think another aspect of this might also be those 20% or so, approximately 20%, are concrete and honest. And that's why they said, well, I don't fit any of these. These categories don't work for me. But the other things to think about when we're talking about, in terms of gender variation, I mean, autistic people also have a disproportionate number of trans people, as well as gay or lesbian or bisexual people among us. And so we want to think about the elements of working effectively with trans people in a healthcare setting, that people with trans experience have high rates of negative healthcare experiences. They're hesitant to seek out healthcare because it's been a generally unfriendly environment for many of them. They're also going to be coming usually from a background of some poverty, more likely than the general population to have trauma backgrounds, maybe have to work in sex work because that's the only way they can support themselves, more likely to have mental health issues and suicide, not necessarily because that's inherent to the trans experience, but because of a lack of social support and social confirmation of who they are, their ways of identifying, more likely to be estranged from their family, even more so than gay or lesbian folks. So trans people are operating with a lack of safety and well-being anyway. And then you think about being trans and being autistic, and it's all squared, right? It's all magnified and multiplied by many times. So the stigma and the discrimination for both their autism-related behaviors and their sexual orientation or gender identification are considerable burdens to carry around. And I think, it's been said, people say, I felt like I had to come out of the closet twice. I had to come out as bi or gay or whatever, and maybe a different gender presentation from what my body looks like, or then saying to people, I'm autistic too. That's a lot of social stigma to push back against. So ways we can help trans autistic people specifically are to use the name they wish to be called by, respectfully inquire about what pronouns they use, and the training I've received is don't ask what pronouns people prefer, because that implies there's some element of choice. The respectful language is to ask, or to just introduce yourself and say, I use she, her pronouns, what do you use? Just using that straightforward language that invites identification and self-naming. And I know that, I work in an emergency room when I'm not doing private practice these days. I know when trans people come in, there's this constant commotion among the staff, and I love these people, they're very well-intentioned, but they're just not informed. And so there's this commotion about, well, he over there, I don't know, is it a she? There's this kind of cumbersome use of language that's off-putting, and people get the vibe. It doesn't feel good to them to come in for care when they're being talked about in that way. And yet we know clearly from research that the suicide rates drop when trans youth are called by the gender identification they want and the name that they want to use. And if you're around trans people at all, you probably heard this phrase about the name they were given at birth. If it doesn't match who they are now, they'll say, that's my dead name. That's a name they do not want used, applied to them. They don't want to hear it again. They want to be able to put that chapter of their lives away and be the person that they are now. So it's really powerful and important to use the language that clients ask us to use and the ways that they self-identify, because they get so little support in other aspects of their lives that this is a thing that it feels small when we grant that to them, but it's actually enormous, and it conveys such respect when we do that for people. And other protective factors besides inclusive language are, as more people are visible in the media, that's protective for trans people. As they have more ability to just be seen in public and in the media, that's helpful for trans people. And anything we can do together to educate other healthcare providers and model this respectfulness is going to be very important and useful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about consent now. We had this question raised earlier, and the potential for sexual expression problems varies greatly because of what I was saying. Oh, you know what? I talked about hypersensitivity, and I forgot to say there's also hyposensitivity in this population. So this is not necessarily gender-based, but some autistic people are less sensitive to their environment. They might get injured without saying anything about it. They might feel a sense of mounting irritability or a mood change and get expressive about that, but they don't even know why. They don't know what's affecting them. So there's widely varying abilities to name and scrutinize one's own experience among autistics. And some people have that, sorry, I skipped over that part. Some people have that hypersensitivity, but others have a sense of hyposensitivity. So again, in a scene, like in an S&M community, it's really important that people are able to name their experience so that they're not experiencing injuries or ending up with consequences from some sexual interaction with a partner that they weren't saying, hey, that's too much, or that hurts, or, stop now. So we need people to have that kind of skill. Some people do extreme sports so that they know where their edge is. Some people do stuff like jujitsu and other martial arts so that they learn over time, like, this is when I have to tap. I have to say stop somehow, and I get the signals from my body when I'm in that kind of struggling interaction with another person. So let's hop back now to consent. That's what I wanted to talk about. So some autistic people are able to sustain a healthy sex life with no particular issues, and it's uncomplicated for them. I don't mean to say this is a universal, but I'm trying to call your attention to things that might be outside your awareness as therapists. So a person with moderate like social impairment might not be able to interact with another person sexually or sustain a romantic relationship. Another person might engage in sexual behavior as a sensory response without really interpreting that there's much social going on with the other person. And, some people enjoy like bondage and domination activities or activities involving pain without necessarily wanting to overlay a sexual component on that. Some people just like the sensations that they're feeling, and they have to have another person to do that with them, but it's not necessarily, they don't perceive it as a sexual or a romantic interaction. It's just a kind of a release that they may experience. And, as the person that Sharon mentioned, some people are very disinterested in sexuality, or it seems repulsive to them, or it's off-putting to them. And it just feels like something they don't want to be involved in. So when we think about this kind of whole range of ways people might experience their sexuality, even if in this very small percentage of the population, it looks like even as the rates of identification rise, about 1.5%, maybe 2% of the population is autistic. So it's a pretty small number of people that we're talking about. But even in that small percentage, there's a very wide range of experience. And I imagine autism is a big name for a lot of different conditions that we just haven't broken down yet. But at any rate, people lack a social script many times and often lack a support network, which is where neurotypical people tend to do their processing and checking about newly formed relationships, right? They're running things by their friends and comparing perceptions and trying to get an understanding of how things are developing in a relationship by talking to other people. And that's not something autistic folks are as likely to do. So they're kind of left to their own resources, and it's more likely to get bad results, like lead them down a path without guidance that maybe they're not in a good relationship, or this isn't going to work out, or they're misperceiving the other person's signals. Don't always have the skills to tell good from bad people. Don't assume that people are lying. So that honest literalness can work against autistic people in sexual relationships. Who knows much about ABA in this room? Applied Behavior Analysis. Is that familiar to anyone? So this is we often hear more about autistic children than we do autistic adults. But there's a widely used form of therapy that's a very intensive therapy that's used for training. It's called Applied Behavioral Analysis. And this is based on work developed by, his name is Lovaas, I think it's Alexander Lovaas. And so he is a behaviorist who tried to figure out how can we help autistic children mainstream. So the therapies consist of things like eye contact, like training autistic children with like food rewards or social rewards to try to look at other people the way neurotypical people do, or to stop moving their hands around, like stop flapping. Like autistic kids will do stuff like this frequently, or they'll just move their hands in a lot of different ways. It's a form of self-stimulation that seems to be soothing, but part of the intent of ABA is to help kids stop doing things that are disruptive to others in the classroom. So I'm bringing this up because part of what you need to develop the muscles for consent is a sense of self, right? You need a sense of autonomy and like, I get to take up space, I have rights, I get to say what I need. In order to give consent, you have to have those kind of building blocks in your person. And yet what ABA therapies do is teach kids, you do what the teacher or the trainer tells you to do, and you ignore the sensations in your own body and use the training to override what you're naturally inclined to do. So my position is that this ABA therapy, which is very, very widespread, this is the only therapy for autistic children that's sanctioned by most insurance companies that will be reimbursed, because there's so many kinds of therapies that insurance companies don't want to pay because they haven't been proven. So ABA can show that they get results, but we autistic adults are raising a lot of questions about, are those the results we want for autistic kids growing up? And is this premise that's generally based on training of rats or dogs what we want to apply to human beings? So you'll see, if you read anything about this, this is exactly the kind of preparation that people are likely to have when they're people are doing this because they want their kids to succeed in the classroom and in life, but it's actually grooming a victim to teach people to override their own instincts and their own trust in their bodies, right? So this is part of why we probably are seeing these huge results of victimization among autistic and other disabled people being sexually victimized. So of those with autism, 78% of people in a widespread study reported at least one instance of sexual victimization. Of the participants in the study without autism, that was 47%. Now those are still horrible numbers. We shouldn't be having 47% of kids being sexually victimized, but we see how much more likely it is to happen to an autistic person than it is to a neurotypical person. And my contention is that ABA therapies probably have a lot to do with that. So people with intellectual disabilities are most at risk of sexual victimization and are sexually assaulted at a rate 7 times higher than those without disabilities. So this is from a study done by NPR. It's a very credible study with big numbers, done for the Justice Department from unpublished federal crime data. So they're more likely to be assaulted by someone they know. It's more likely to just happen in everyday life. In the course of everyday life, it's not like stranger danger where, you're walking down the wrong dark street or you didn't protect yourself in some way. This is often a domestic crime. And of course, many people with intellectual disabilities have caregivers who are not respecting them or protecting them. So these crimes go mostly unrecognized, they're unprosecuted, unpunished, and the abuser then is free to go and abuse again because they're very difficult to prosecute. So police are often reluctant to take these cases on because they're so difficult to win in court that they just get thrown by the wayside. So I think you probably have some good sense about what the corrective actions are. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but I do want to say that many disabled and autistic people say that when they become adults, having sex with someone is the only time they get to feel normal. They have some job that pays a stipend that's not paying a fair hourly wage like the rest of us get. They often can't drive a car. They don't have the financial resources to qualify for a credit card and things like that. So for a lot of disabled adults, having sex is a way to express, like, I'm a person, I'm legit, I get to make my own choices. So, not being treated like a child, not having to tell somebody where you are or who you're with is a very novel and heady experience. So it's lovely that people have that sensation, but it also means it's much more likely that people will put themselves in, end up in, I shouldn't say put themselves in, but end up in situations where they could be victimized because it's so thrilling to have some sense that somebody's interested in you, somebody desires you, and you get to be a grown-up who's deciding this for yourself. So, we want to recognize that there are ways we can support people in developing ways to identify and experience what respectful relationships are like that can grow and benefit both people, and not to end up in a state